Sorry, I'm a little out of it.
Trying again. 1, 2, 3.
4, 5, 6.
Great. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Adaam.
Welcome to Uncertain Things, the
podcast where we're learning to count.
to how to make podcasts.
Exactly.
Today we have Matt Welch. He is editor-at-large at Reason Magazine. He was involved in jumpstarting a variety of outlets reported from around the world and just has had one hell of an interesting career as a truly independent-minded journalist.
Mm-hmm. But wait, Adaam, you didn't mention that he's also a co-host of the Fifth Column.
The Fifth Column podcast. I can smell the scotch just saying the name. Mm-hmm. Well, we invited him to join us on the day of Biden's inauguration because Matt's perspective on things is just so healthy, refreshingly not insane, and as I mentioned before, has that libertarian disdain for all political tribes that's especially needed in times like these. Mm-hmm. We got into the whole question of unity, which was one of the themes in Biden's inauguration. And I'm not sure how much we delved into it, but I think we all agree about how, and sorry if we're too on brand, but how frustratingly and intentionally stupid and cheap everyone is being about the unity conversation. I'm tired just trying to remember all the inane op-eds from the Democratic side about whether or not Trumpists should be welcome at the table, whether or not there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and from the Republican side on Biden is being hypocritical about unity because look at all the Democratic policies that he's trying to advance, and seeing so many sanctimonious Republican politicians, some of whom still cast doubt about Biden's legitimate victory, malign their heads off about how Biden's rhetoric is divisive or Biden's policies are divisive. It just reinforces this feeling that nobody believes in anything. Nobody has a vision of what kind of world we want to live in, but everyone is just so committed to the battlefield itself. So now the word unity is what masks were 6 months ago.
Right.
And thus on to the next stupid battle. Mm-hmm. Aside from that, we talked with Matt a lot about the responsibility of journalists and media for this current moment. What's the responsibility of the individual reporter, if any, of the media outlet, of the platforms that host them? What's all of these people's responsibility towards mediating this madness?
Right. And Matt puts a lot of weight on the role of the individual to take responsibility for what's happening around us, and we get into a bit of a debate around that, the role of the journalist versus the role of the consumer versus the role of the distributor. I don't necessarily agree on putting so much emphasis on the individual, but I do think that he made some really good points about why perestroika begins in the home.
It's interesting. Yeah, you're much more keen than I am to point fingers at the platforms. I am really stuck in the middle, and because I'm very much anti-regulation. In our conversation with Robbie Suave a month ago,
fellow Reason colleague of Matt's.
Right. I was very much with him, despite not being a full-fledged economic libertarian, on his suspicion of this bipartisan push for regulating big tech. I've already mentioned my flippant aphorism about this issue. If there's an idea that's gaining bipartisan support, it's probably a bad one. And you can really feel this happening with big tech, with a lot of ideas being tossed around that will probably not get people the results they really want. And you really need only watch how Congress conducted the tech hearings in the past 2 years to know just how little you should trust these people with regulating that industry. But at the same time, I'm also very uncomfortable with not taking stock of how much these technologies are changing and fucking up with the way we think about the world and interact with each other, because they obviously are. And this is really part of the emotional social conflagration that we are experiencing right now.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying that it's all tech's fault either. I'm also still kind of trying to evolve and figure out my position on this. And hopefully, like we'll pursue some conversations in the future that kind of dive into this more. But yeah, I just think that there's blame to be spread around. So, but either way, I think like Matt's points are very well taken, and the individuals in our society do have to take responsibility for some of what's happening. By the way, we get into a lot about, cancel culture and the way that we're behaving in terms kind of culturally as well as like in the political sphere.
Yeah. I guess his argument is sorry, I was thinking about your previous sentence, like realizing that Matt's argument is along the lines of, hey, Bloomberg, stop trying to take away Americans' bucket-sized soft drinks. That's not the way to get Americans to change their diets. The only way Americans are going to start eating healthy is if they choose to do so. Your laws aren't going to make any positive difference. They're just going to create more criminals. So same applies to media, I guess. Is that a sufficient answer? Again, I have no idea. I am so tired and clueless.
That's the uncertain things way, isn't it?
Please, if you haven't already, subscribe, follow us wherever we are Uncertain Pod on social medias. And so media is already plural, sorry.
Rate us on Apple. Give us them 5 stars.
Yes, give us a 5-star review on Apple. Why not? Be kind.
Be kind, give 5.
Doesn't rhyme. And with that pathetic attempt at a rhyme, we give you Matt Welch. Matt Welch, thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome to be here on Inauguration Day. It's exciting.
These have been horrible 2 months, politically speaking, for people who read the news. I couldn't think of a better person, or at least many, who could do a better job trying to help us make sanity out of what's going on.
I'm flattered that you think that I would have any help at all for such a project, but do what we can.
Catharsis also works.
It's been a very strange part of, especially what we do at the Fifth Column podcast. Like the response that we get is the word sanity just comes up over and over again, which is just not what you'd expect from 3 assholes getting drunk, but that's what happens apparently.
It also is a commentary on the state of all other discourse, I would say.
That's true.
So where are your thoughts on this crisp Inauguration Day?
Going into it, I understood that Joe Biden was and is kind of by comportmental necessity just sort of geared toward doing a speech about unity, and also that that's kind of what the guy in that position has to say after all the unpleasantness, and that I'm just really not the target audience for that particular message right now. Really nothing against him, but just
against unity.
You're in the give me partisanship and give it now.
It's not partisanship. It's just that it's hard to believe in the ancient faiths sometimes, and right now, unity and a common national purpose and a bunch of other stuff, it just feels like it, whether or not it should feel like that, and we should respond in a better way. It's just Lincoln, better angels of our nature, this, that, we've heard a lot of that before, and we do need to lead ourselves out of this thing. I just, as ever, I feel like the way out of it isn't necessarily going to be speeches, and the political class is always and forever, so is Hollywood always trying to find the speech that's going to turn it around. It's my favorite part in any movie. And then the king made the king's speech and it was all better, or Churchill made that speech, or whatever. The Joseph McCarthy.
I'm partial to the Independence Day one with the aliens. That one's really good.
See, I never saw that one, but I think I've seen clips of it enough, and dude, it's a speech. It's like what Allen Iverson says about practice. Are you talking about practice? Really?
It's the problem that histories and more so films and novels are written by writers and who tend to have the narcissism of putting so much emphasis on the power of the word to persuade the masses and change the tides of history.
Although this year I was kind of heartened, and maybe it's just because I'm consuming less media, but every year there's always the really terrible Thomas L. Friedman column, like that is writing the president's speech. This is what the president should say. It's like when the columnist is volunteering for job of speechwriter, that's when you know that the last fresh idea he had was 3 years ago, if that. So I don't think we didn't see a whole lot of that. It's just, we're tired as a country, and it's depressing. Super depressing to even look up from whatever dungeon that I'm sitting in and occasionally glance at the TV and just sort of see people walking, in the middle of a green zone where the only people in attendance are wearing, combat uniforms. Just like kind of takes the fun out of a situation which I'm already, again, I'm not the target audience. I'm not geared to receive the pomp and circumstance. Like watching cable news during this day, and I had to turn it on to Fox just because it's like, give me an opposition place, because it's all the the Brian Williams voice, it's the majesty of the peaceful transfer of power. It's like, dude, not this year. Come on, everything kind of sucks. Like let's mail it on a cocktail napkin, get back to work. Is my point.
But on the other hand, I guess they're trying to convince themselves that nothing happened in the past 4 years.
Yeah.
We're exactly where we left off when Obama left office. Just look, even Lady Gaga is singing and nobody's talking about American carnage.
Well, it's hard. You can't, there's going to be an incoherence associated with it, right? So like in the same paragraph, Joe Biden was talking about how, folks, we're one America. We're all got to come together, etc. Okay, great. You got to do that. But then he also has to kind of like condemn the insanity that's happened. So like he wants unity. And also it's really important that y'all stop lying, you bunch of white supremacists. And it's like, okay, that unity message might be falling on their ears a little bit different. But again, you have to do that. I mean, like a terrible thing happened. And a series of kind of riffs in what should be kind of, to use the worst word of the last 4 years, the norms. But like that actually turned out to mean something a little bit. And we have to acknowledge that and call it by its name, preferably without getting super hysterical about it. But that's the thing that's impossible about American politics and media, is that just everything is geared towards the hysteria. So as ever, just if you're going to watch the stuff, watch it on C-SPAN, and don't listen to anyone talk about it because it's bad.
I kind of, because of that, I think I was kind of into the pomp and circumstance.
See,
I kind of,
you're the target audience. That's good.
I don't watch TV, so I'm only watching it because I'm with my partner at my partner's parents' place at the moment, and they watch TV. So like, I never would have turned this thing on. But yeah, there was something about it feeling like, oh man, America has like traditions and there's a history and like, and normally I wouldn't care so much, but there was something about it that felt kind of a little bit comforting despite the disunion of our current state.
Was it the J.Lo medley? Is that what did that do it? Because that's what got me.
That's what touched you.
Kind of, because I mean, This Land Is Your Land is a terrible commie song, but it's great. So I mean, you gotta take your hat off, but then just to medleyfy it, and I think at some point she even slipped in a lyric or a chorus from her own like back catalog. Like that's what I want to see. A little Spanish in the middle of it. Like make it weird. Do that. That makes me feel patriotic.
So you started tugging at many different threads that I want to get into. So the first thing that just I'm going to randomly pick at, I don't like pageantry. I'm repelled by pageantry normally, but there was something comforting about Biden being so anodyne. Is just listening to him was ambient. You're falling asleep, and that's a great thing. I really think most people are tired of the politics of constant outrage and feeling like your head is on broil. So nodding off during a political speech is excellent. The danger is that it also creates apathy when you start taking those traditions for granted. And then you find underneath this pomp and circumstance that give Vanessa the feels, there is room for corruption to fester. And I'm talking about the everyday normal corruption of Washington that has always existed, but without Trump, nobody could give a shit.
So I've had CNN on most of the day, which again, just I'm like you, Vanessa. Like I don't watch this stuff. I occasionally go on, less so in the COVID era, but I had it on today, and there was all just like, whereas the last 4 years have been people shaking their damn heads at just like, I can't believe this guy. That's basically been the text of every cable news segment for 5 years, really. Now it's like, I can't believe that we're talking about normal things. This administration is just going to care about facts. It's just such a relief. I mean, like, this is verbatim stuff that they're saying. It's like, dude, it's okay, I get it. We're all having a day, and there's a sense of relief. I feel it too. I'm glad that Trump is gone. I despised him as a president and as a human being. But like, it gets immediately into that corruption of, therefore this other stuff is going to be good or should be taken at face value. Today, on Twitter, and apologies for ever going on Twitter, but during Biden's speech, he made a lot of nods towards how it's important that, we denounce the lies that have gone on, which is true. We should denounce the lies, especially, but not only of the Stop the Steal garbage that way too many Republicans, even to this day, keep banging on about. And he's like, we need to be grounded in facts. And, I'll vow to you that I'm going to level with you. And so I had a tweet, like, just mashing those things up, and at the bottom saying, great, let's hold him to that, shall we? That's it. That's the tweet. People screaming at me, like, either screaming at me just because everyone's inflamed in general. It's either like, well, where were you during Trump? It's like, I don't know, man. Get a Google, and it's not hard to find. Obviously, you're being soft on Biden now. It's like, no, what I'm trying to say that people are just so inflamed, but like, there is a sense, at least from some of the negative reaction, is like, give him a day, man. Why do you have to be a libertarian jerk? It's like, dude, it's not even about libertarianism. It's about journalismism. Like, we should be giving the people who hold power some scrutiny. And if they are, if they want to make an ethic out of telling the truth, and I want them to, like, one of my over my shoulder is Václav Havel, and on his first speech to January New Year's Day speech, which is a tradition in then Czechoslovakia and now Czech Republic. His first main speech, he said, I presume that you did not elect me president so that I too would lie to you. And that to me is one of the greater speeches around. Like, he had this whole concept of living in truth, or living within the truth, calling things by their proper names. It was part of his dissidence. It was part of his life, and it's had a profound effect on me. So don't get me wrong. If you say that you are holding truth to be a high value and ethic, great. Since you're a politician, you're probably lying about that to some degree, or delusional to some degree. But also, you're laying down a marker and reminding the rest of us that we should call you on it when you do. And one of the frustrations during the Obama presidency for me, because that was right around the time when the kind of the rise of fact checking became this institutional thing, is that for about half of the presidency, the fact checking apparatus, or whatever how you pronounce that word, was still aimed at like Sarah Palin. Like, the lie of the year, one of those years, was Sarah Palin talking about death panels. It's like, okay, I get it. She's also like, hosts a reality TV show in Alaska or some crap, and he's the president who, by the way, in selling Obamacare, did lie a few times in ways that are, and eventually apologized for them. So like, don't the exhale, the expression of relief shouldn't be, now I get to go take a nap. And I think what too many journalists do not understand about the audiences that react in a hostile way towards them is some of the why of that hostility. It's more like, there's something wrong with people who react to us because they're allergic to the truth. Okay, that's one, might contain some truth in that unkind analysis, but it's also, if you're surrounded all the time by a certain tone and a tenor and a certain lack of consistency as applied to different sides of the debate, and you just are, like, just stop pretending that you're not. All you have to do is just turn on the TV. I'm sitting, I was slacking with one of my colleagues at Reason today, like, they're going to make me an OAN watcher here by the end of the day if I have to keep watching all of this, like, hagiography about Joe Biden, who's been with us. Again, nothing wrong with the guy, but he's been with us for 50 years doing this stuff. Like, he's not some kind of new savior. But, I'm grateful to the Democratic Party that they elected a guy whose basic selling proposition is that we can all maybe take a nap, him first. I'm like, we kind of need that right now.
It's really interesting, actually, what you're saying, because I think there's been a lot of conversation over the past year or so around this idea of truth and different truths. But I think that there hasn't been as much conversation, or if there has, I haven't been plugged into it, about this idea of tenor and what happens when you overwhelm people with a kind of tenor of conversation, and when people feel like they can't get into the conversation because of that environment that's created, or this like mist around it. And I feel like that's something that Adaam and I talk about a lot. And I think that Adaam's introduced me a lot, because I think he is a bit more plugged into these communities that feel like they are censored and can't speak out. And I don't know, I feel like that's that observation is actually, I think, quite important. And I'd be curious to maybe talk a little bit more about it, because I'm sure both you and Adaam have a lot to say about it.
One way of though that I think about this, and I was a columnist about the media. I was a media columnist, in addition to being someone who's launched a lot of different media projects since the age of 22. So I've kind of have noticed the way that the journalism industry considers its own work for a long time, and traced those developments. And last summer, in the wake of the George Floyd protests and the BLM related protests and some of the rioting and looting that happened and the discussion thereof, and there was a whole a season of purging that happened at a lot of media institutions and cultural institutions, some of it quite hysterical, some of it maybe overdue reckonings of people who'd behaved badly for a long time. Around that time, Wesley Lowery, who used to write for the Washington Post and other places, who's a pretty interesting journalist, had a piece that I believe was in the New York Times that was kind of an attack on, and I think a little bit of a straw man of an attack on the notion of objectivity in journalism. And he was kind of calling for, taking off the gloves, essentially, and having a kind of a new moral underpinning of journalism, making moral judgments with journalism as we're going. And I wrote a critique of that. He ended up coming on the Fifth Column podcast. We had a very interesting and productive conversation. But one of my criticisms of that way as an approach is that when you're going to spend your time at the end of that policing adjectives. You see a lot of journalists doing that already. It's like, they're always upset at the Associated Press or the New York Times because they didn't say that X wasn't just sort of bad or controversial, questionable, but you didn't say it was racist. Or, Trump says this, but you didn't call it a lie in the tweet. You have to call it a lie. This sort of moral clarity that they were looking for kind of gets you distracted in maximum name calling against this side, and in ways that are not evenly applied, and very obvious to those who are not part of those sides that it's not going to be evenly applied. And for me also in kind of a truth sense is that it's not going, chances are you're going to be led away from truth, even in the name of, hey, I'm going to take off, I'm going to get rid of both sidesism, which is a very bizarre term of insult term these days. And I'm going to find the one truth. There are plenty of philosophers out there who warn against the excesses of when you believe that there is just one truth that therefore doesn't need to have the same kind of scrutiny. And you're going to create an echo chamber. You're going to be, as we've seen in the last few weeks, in this sort of deplatforming urge that so many people have been calling forth, that if you just kind of expel people from the public square or whatever square that you're participating in, you're not going to hear other points of view. You're not going to hear the natural kind of drag on sort of normal claims. And that's actually, I think at this point, it's kind of by design. People want to create a world of like-minded morality that then is going to do journalism about how the people they've expelled are wrong or bad, and that's not a good recipe. I'm very worried about that. My recommendation, which no one likes, is that how about just doing your factual work better? And it's not to say that you shouldn't make moral judgments. I do it all the time. I've done it since I've been doing journalism 1986. And I've been trying to find the right words, including words that transgress normal kind of newspaperese or whatever, to get at a, more lacerating judgment. I think that's fine. But like, it's fine when you don't let that corrupt your evidence finding process in such a way that makes you blind or to the truth or leads you towards falsehood, which you then propagate. I think they'll be much more convincing just by getting stuff right, rather than, just asserting, oh, the cops let everybody in on Capitol Hill because they were racist or something. You heard a lot of things like that after the Capitol Hill riots. Do your job better instead of trying to deplatform people and call them deplorable, even though many of them might well be deplorable.
The problem seems to me to start when calling out other people's factuality becomes nothing more than a cudgel to use against an opponent, and not really a value that we want to elevate as a standard of practice. And across the board, we see how gleefully and gloatingly people will point out and say, look at this factual error. Whether it was nefarious or an honest mistake, it doesn't matter. While quietly brushing under the rug the same types of mistake being made in their own home. The truth is that there's just diminishing demand for factual reporting. This is not what the audience wants. They want warfare.
We used to have a saying back in the late 1980s, those of us of a certain age, and it doesn't make sense, to be clear, but it's that perestroika begins in the home. Which perestroika was in the air. It was just like the idea of making the world a better place. Of course, that's not what perestroika was about, but it doesn't matter. It sounded funny when you were a jackass 18-year-old in California. But like it does kind of start there. I think consumers of news have a responsibility that way too many are not taking. They need to hold the outlets that they support or read or watch, listen to in check. They need to choose them well. They need to not cherry pick, for God's sake, one single little bit here and say, see, Antifa did the riots. See, the Dominion machine, it was controlled by the Venezuelans. It's a big country. There's a lot of data points. You can always find one. Trump won one of those 64 cases that he took to court to challenge the election, but he was 1-63. That's a bad record. You have a responsibility. And I know some people who are really smart or have been really smart in the past who held onto these little anomalies like life rafts and like try to throw them at me and say, see, you use Trump derangement syndrome. Why aren't you following the truth? It's like, no, dude, you are doing a really, really bad job of news consumption. And as you do a bad job of news consumption, people are making money off of you. There's an interview with head of, I believe, Newsmax in early November. I believe Ben Smith from New York Times did one. There was another one that appeared somewhere else. And the basic gist of it, and you should go look at as opposed to listen to my rendering of it, was like, dude, you know that a lot of what you're peddling right now is just garbage, right? And the guy's like, yeah, there might be, but there's an audience for it. And there is. And there's not just an audience for it in terms of news, but there's an audience for it in terms of the entire kind of political churn machine, the grifting, the 501c3s and 4s who are always sending out scary emails about how the bad guys are going to eat your babies. The people who are running ads for those people and are, in the mix and are on cable news shows. It's kind of a bad racket. And, but there's a consumer driven quality to it. People have a demand for their biases and fears to be confirmed. So it starts with the consumer doing better. It goes on to the individual practitioner, in this case, journalist, to not get caught up in it. Once you start getting caught up in the team exercises, I'm a master of just atrocious analogies. So the way I look at it is like there's two rivers. One's going in this direction, one's going that direction, and they're going super fast, or this direction, right? Opposite directions is what I mean. And in the middle of the two rivers is a strip of land. And you're standing on the strip of land, but the banks on both sides are eroding. They want to pull your feet in, and then you're just going to get caught up and swept away. And like it takes some doing to not get caught up. There's like a demand. People get real mad at you because you didn't, in a moment when they were all riled up, to get caught up in the same way. And sometimes it's not even like a question of the like technical content of your words or your work. It's that your emotional tenor wasn't strong enough. You didn't emote hard enough about this terrible thing that happened. So I just don't have time for you anymore. So like, I think journalistic practitioners, in the way that I have conceived of journalism, which is, probably becoming outnumbered over time, is to be instinctively allergic to all that stuff. You want to be able to keep your head about you. Hopefully you won't be late to outrages, things that are rightfully deserving of your scorn and your enthusiasms. But that, don't get caught into serving people's base needs. And that's just like the very bare beginning of doing better at all this stuff. But it's really hard. And you can definitely get rewarded in short-term bursts for doing cheap, cynical stuff out there. And you see it every day. And, I saw it on TV all day long.
But this is just a problem. It's all just unreflective reactions, emotional reactions to predictable postures and stances and even styles that you're expecting to be served by your news suppliers. You're primed to either throw endless adulation at Trump's feet or to despise him. You're primed to either worship at the altar of social justice or to fiendishly, trollishly mock it. And we know that this is partly, at least, because of the distribution system being social media, prioritizing outrage and binary excitable reactions. And that without having the old guardrails of an institutionalized media. So this is my challenge. This seems to be the result of the libertarian paradise. We are at a place where we have vanquished most of our old gatekeepers, which is a wonderful thing for the free flow of information. But it appears that in the process, we've also vanquished all our old gatekeepers. So how can we even hope to establish any kind of standard for our profession that does not rely on the basest human emotions, the lowest common denominator, and the social Darwinism of Twitter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a paradox, and I think one of the ways of dealing with this is kind of a way like how does one deal if you have a Twitter account? How do you deal with a Twitter account? Everyone complains Twitter is awful. Well, yeah, it is. It can be awful, but also on a daily basis, if you see something that comes into your feed and you're like, I don't like the tone of that. I don't like the world that's coming from. You should be using the mute button, people. You should be unfollowing the people who are dumping garbage into your Twitter feed. I manicure the hell out of mine, and I'm never using the block button or anything like that. But I will notice over time who is dumping this kind of anti-intellectual, illiberal, super overheated and not very useful stuff. And I will. Or who are trolls, and I don't happen to appreciate trolling. Some people do, I don't. And I want trolls out of my time. I don't want to see trolling. And so I have curated, with a little bit of effort, my feed to be like that, because I still want to have use professionally and also for enjoyment on occasion, my Twitter feed. It takes work.
That was Chloe Valdery's suggestion. Just mute people, but you're putting a lot of emphasis on individual responsibility.
Correct.
Like again, your perestroika starts at home, but the deck is just so heavily stacked against sanity. All you need is this tiny little emotional trigger that turns people into these crazy partisan rage hulks, and that's it. They're addicts now. And these people are just going to come back again and again to get their fix of how Democrats stole the election or how Purim customs are cultural appropriation. Now, I'm really not a Frankfurt schooler who thinks that people are automatons and can't make their own decisions. But I'm also recognizing that we are helpless animals sometimes when the emotional cognitive stimulation is more than we can handle. That's why addiction is a real thing. So the question that I keep asking myself, and now I'm asking you, is in the absence of gatekeeping, how do you help people change their news consumption behavior into something more dispassionate and fact-based?
I'm not making anyone change anything, man. Come on. No, I'm actually meeting people who I didn't know, including you, by using these wonderful tools and meeting viewpoints and getting to experiment in the creation of new media in ways that were unimaginable when I was a young critter, and that is wonderful. There's we used to say back in the 90s. I'm just gonna give you my old man phrases, but like back when technology was such that everyone could at least make their own band tape. That 99% of everything sucks. Of every cassette or piece of music, recorded music, is bad. That's probably a bit too much, but it might not be. And that's fine. It always was. It's just there's more people who do it. And so you find through the kind of flatness and the democratization of it all, you have a shorter circuit to finding that quality out there. And, I might take some issue with even the sense that you use the word dispassionate. I wouldn't really use that word. What I would say is that I want better truth seeking, even if it has a hot-headedness, even if it has big adjectives and everything like that. I just want people to be better about approaching and disseminating truth, and that's also also conversing in a way that is truthful, not by the letter, but by the spirit. What I mean is, and this is something that I've always aimed to do in television when we started The Independents on Fox Business Channel with Camille Foster and Kennedy, with the Fifth Column. Reason has been doing this for a long time. Bill Maher is kind of the pioneer of this idea in the 1990s with his Politically Incorrect show, which is, what would it sound like if weird but smart people talked normally about politics, which is, admitting where you don't know what you're talking about and kind of speculating here, having fun, making fun of people, making inopportune jokes. That to me, there's an honesty in that is much preferable and connects with people in a much more visceral and useful, galvanizing way than the kind of ritualized, I'm a Democratic consultant, and I'm going to tell you that I think that what Joe Biden did today was terrible or great or whatever. There's something dishonest about the professionalized ritual of media that could be cut through with a less factually perfect but more honest approach towards media. And these new technology tools help us discover this. What is the podcast world that we live in now, if not, the last loophole? Did you all see the Associated Press headline from 4 days ago saying, specialist warned that extremists have found a free speech loophole? Podcasts. Loophole! Yes. It makes me want to start a new podcast called Loophole. But the rise of the podcast world, which I'm super late in getting to, certainly as a listener, but even as a participant, started doing it in 2016 after my wife bugging me for 10 years to jump in. What's a podcast? But that's part of that world. People appreciate that kind of approach and sense of honesty about it, and that includes hey, I want you to be listening and interacting with me, even though you totally love Trump and I totally don't. That's fine. Why should that be an impediment to anything? And we're always dealing with listeners like this, and it's a great community that has arisen out of that. So I think that you can build an audience for this kind of stuff, and you can even curate your feeds and attract like-minded people through just sort of being disciplined about how you interact with and provide information to people. It's a little bit utopian sounding or pie in the sky. I'm from California. I'm a hippie. This is what happens.
Techno-hippie.
But techno-hippie who just doesn't understand tech at all, by the way. But yeah, it's a
Techno-hippie troglodyte.
It's a problem, it's a challenge, and it's eternal. And it sure beats for me what I remember in my lifetime, which is, there was a time I used to be a typesetter. There was a time when we needed typesetters. Holy crap! And now we just really, really don't. And that has, for the most part, been a boon and created more interesting conversations. It just doesn't absolve us of our responsibility as consumers to demand better and more interesting information, reward the people who are doing that, and then also be better citizens ourselves. The theory of democracy in media has always been to create the better citizen. I'm less interested in that as a conscious project, but that's how we're able to endure all this, awful, messy freedom.
I take your point about dispassion. You're right. It's the wrong word. I would love for people to connect more with their anger. I thrive on hatred myself. It's a wonderful thing. Where it gets creepy is when you see those passions completely untethering people from reality. I can't tell you how many people whom until days ago I still greatly admired wrote last night on their Facebook, "Just wait. He's not going to be confirmed. Just wait. The feds are coming. Trust the plan." So my perspective is I'm seeing objectively brilliant people losing their fucking minds, and I feel totally helpless.
Sorry, Dom. I sorry to step on your frazzledom.
Go ahead. I'm doomed for today.
No, I really want to ask Matt about this. I mean, so I will admit that it is refreshing to hear someone who's pro tech, because I've just been submerged in anti-tech rhetoric for the last few years. And so it is nice to remember that, like, hey, tech has good qualities and it's really a positive, has positives too. So I'm not saying that I'm not happy to hear it, but I'm also a little puzzled because, like, we've gone through this kind of like the many layers of the issues at hand upon the consumer of the news, upon the producer of the news, and there is a big part of this puzzle which is the distributor, and that is tech. And we can even take podcasting as an example, because like big tech is not making money from podcasts, right? Like only by we are so lucky to exist because Apple kind of forgot about us and hasn't like really put money into Apple Podcasts in like over 10 years. But it's just like, okay, we're not going to touch it, but we're also not going to like disturb it. And so like by the good graces of Apple does this whole ecosystem exist. But it's not like we are like the podcast ecosystem is all about these like conversations. It's not about getting a lot of eyeballs and making a lot of money. And so when I think about what's wrong with journalism, it's not the podcasting world. It's all of the things that are visual, that are being shared, that are going viral. And I think there's this whole business model that is incentivizing all the wrong things. And it just doesn't feel like you can extricate that part of the puzzle from everything that's going wrong.
There's always going to be incentives for venality. There's always going to be market for it. Always. And it doesn't matter who's peddling it. I was spending, or like, what is the latest technology to do it? I spent a lot of the weekend, as one does, reading the 1947 Hutchins Commission report on a free and responsible press, which is fascinating subject, but of another time. But it was an elite attempt beginning in 1944. So with, the rise of, fascism is all around us. And, where did we go soft? What did we do in our media diet that produced this moment? You can see why I was freshening my history on this, because there's some interesting parallels. And the conclusions that they came up with are like, these new technologies and all these tabloid newspaper values, they're just going for sensation. They're using hate speech. It's frequently racist, and maybe people should like slow down and stop seeking sensation. It's funny. And it's perennial. And they're also, that was at the dawn of radio, just before TV kind of takes off. And you can feel a sense of visceral horror at mass media. And there was a theory, I think it's called Gresham's law or close to it, that when a media becomes mass instead of kind of, liturgical top down, then it's going to crowd out quality. It's going to be more hard for quality to rise. And it's a fear, and it's a fear that's driven in part, in my view, of both a mistaken and a paternalistic sense of the audience as vessels. The people are beaming in their messages to these vessels and activating them to go into a direction. The Orson Welles' War of the Worlds was the Big Bang theory for a lot of people, because there's a whole myth about how everyone went crazy and started jumping off buildings and stuff. Didn't happen that way, but people thought of that. The Frankfurt School of criticism and theory really saw culture as a sort of transmission device and to activate the proletariat in one direction or another. I don't think that's how we consume media. I mean, you're talking about you're expressing your own sense of dismay at the things that are produced by technology. I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter. You know what the 12-year-old's been doing? Sea shanties.
On TikTok.
Sea shanties on TikTok like crazy. And it's like super creative and fun and bizarre and like pulling this old culture back in the new, and some of it makes money and most of it doesn't. And who cares? It's this great creative thing, especially during a pandemic. They don't get out much, and it's a nice way for them to do it. And as far as like making money, dude, tell Joe Rogan he's not making money. Bro's making a lot of money, and Spotify's making money off podcasts. It's happening. Of course, most of the stuff does not and will not, and it has ever been thus. I mean, I was a part of the blogging revolution after 9/11, which was really fun to take part in. Again, as someone who doesn't understand technology even a little bit, but it was an initial rush around the usual gatekeeping in media, and it had a very, very liberating effect. And it also brought forth a lot of crap and a lot of stupid pathology. A lot of people got captured by their audiences. Lord knows we've seen a lot of that go around since in every fora. But I don't think that the way to solve the crap problem is to kind of like throw your hands up in the air. But at some point, there's going to be a lot of crap that's consumed. There's going to be a lot. Politics is, I would argue, kind of fundamentally structured as a pretty crappy business. It's the organization of hatreds. That's really what it is. And there's all this kind of argle-bargle around it. It's not a very noble thing. That's with us. And so we live in this fallen world. What do we do? And how do we respond? I just want to make sure that we don't respond in ways that are going to legally restrict the speech of people or their opportunities to speak. And then culturally, I don't want us to respond as individuals by seeking to banish people off of places, or like there's so much tattling going on. Mother Jones magazine, it's not a sister magazine, but they're in the same publishing category of opinion magazines. The editor there, who I know, Clara Jeffrey, was like encouraging her Twitter followers to call up their cable providers to tell them to get rid of Fox News on their cable channels. You can hate Fox News, it's fine. But like, what a weird thing. It's a journalist encouraging people to call up and have tattling on another journalistic company. That was just it's unheard of. Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough were like looking in the camera and saying, Facebook, you're a disgrace to humanity, and should be shut down. It's like, what's going on with people? What that censorious instinct is going to lead to bad things. And in the short term, it's going to lead to those companies that are Apple and that are Amazon that have these sort of choke points. They're going to be put under political pressure to exercise them. And that is what we are seeing right now. I don't want it to become legal pressure. But the first thing that's going to happen is that it's going to be cultural pressure that will bring the legal pressure. I don't want that. I want a culture of free speech and free exchange, not kicking people off places.
You're taking me to one of the points that I want to ask you about. So I am having this ongoing argument with a number of friends, including Vanessa's partner, about this horribly termed issue of cancel culture and whether or not that's something that should be, of concern. And one of his arguments is that ostracism can be a great tool to resolve conflicts and draw lines of permissible behavior without involving the state. So he's almost making a libertarian defense of cancel culture. My perspective, in contrast, is that of a culturist, somebody who puts a lot, maybe too much emphasis on culture, like the authors that I accuse of overemphasizing the power of the written word. I perhaps put too much emphasis on the power of cultural institutions and the free dissemination of ideas to shape society. So for me, the moment the prevalent culture becomes too, like you said, censorious and tattletale and witch-seeking, then you start losing a lot of the things that make a society vibrant, alive, dynamic, and just worth living in. So as a libertarian, where do you stand on this quote-unquote cancel culture debate?
I try not to use the phrase, for reasons that you kind of alluded to there. What I don't want to see in the world is a pile-ons of people that are not based in anything resembling due process. You don't have to adjudicate every single claim in the world. You can have an opinion about a bad guy being bad. I have an opinion that Ted Cruz, if he shows up in public anywhere, I'd love to see him booed for the rest of his life. Just booed. There's Ted Cruz at the football game. Boo! I think that'd be great. I think he's a shameful person. And he behaved badly. I look forward to him losing his next election and treated like a pariah. I think shame is good. It's a free association right, for sure. Boycotts
But I thought libertarians love the Freedom Caucus. I'm kidding. Interesting group of people. They might be part of the Patriot Party sooner rather than later. But so ostracism is fine, especially when it's directed at people who are actually powerful, who have done things that you don't need to do a lot more research on. Ted Cruz and his behavior during Stop the Steal, we got a handle on it. There might be some other thing that comes up, but we saw what he did in plain daylight. We're not depending on someone spreading a story on Twitter that we can't fact check. I know too many people whose lives have been really hurt badly by online swarms. And these are people who are not powerful, who are not public officials in any way, shape, or form, who were accused of things that grossly distorted whatever the root thing was that they've done, and their lives and their businesses were ruined. That to me is bad behavior. The piling on of the sort of online swarms, especially against randos, or just people who are not necessarily sticking their necks out as public figures, and done by people, including way too many journalists in the last season, in particular over the summer and the post George Floyd moment. You should back up your accusations as a journalist. You shouldn't be egging people on. You shouldn't be egging your followers on to go be mean to people and to drag people. On a few occasions in which I've had disagreements, or the Fifth Column podcast has had disagreements with people, we always, first of all, try not to talk about it much in public because it's boring. But to the extent that we do, we're like, hey, look, anyone who likes us, do not be a jerk to this person at all. Just that in my name, don't do that. It's no good. There's people who tattle on people's bosses for things that they do that have nothing to do with their work, but could be construed badly. That's the type of behavior that I don't want to see. Is there a culture associated with it? Yes, there is a culture. I mean, and it's one of kind of who came up with a really good phrase.
it's like outrage spelunking, but it's better than that. But it's basically, dumpster diving for the worst possible interpretation of someone at a possible worst moment, elevating that as their defining characteristic, spreading that around, and then either trying explicitly to get them fired or defrocked in such a way. That's all disgraceful behavior. And part of my shame culture is to shame people who do that in ways in which it's provably false what they're saying. Like they are the ones making up a lie about a person, and not being generous. And yeah, to say that that's not with us is like you're not paying attention, nor are you taking into consideration the chilling effects that it has on free speech of normal people, people who aren't public figures. I've been a public figure, in a small and insignificant way since 1986. I'm used to speaking in public. So if I criticize the local initiative at my public schools here, my daughter's public schools, to combat white supremacy in their words, or segregation in their words, I do not get upset when people call me a racist, because I can say that they're being ridiculous and I can go back at them. But I know so many parents in this area, and I've written at length about this, who are terrified to issue even the smallest criticism at any number of initiatives the local school system is doing, because the local school system has weaponized the word racist against just people who are participating in the public process. Is that cancel culture at some point? Like, who cares what we call it? But it's a thing that happens where people are being tarred with the most possible toxic deal killers of characterizations about what they do. And if they are not made of at least some Teflon or used to that process, they'll just, instead of like getting anywhere near a public conversation, they'll say, you know what, I'm just going to sit on my hands and not talk. That's bad. I want those people to participate in the system. So I will go into those places and without being a jerk, I will say what I believe without fear of myself doing it, because it pisses me off so much, the intimidation of what they're trying to do to other people.
I just quickly want to argue that we do need a name for it, just one that hasn't been made icky by Trump. And the reason is that we're dealing with something very, I think, specific to our current situation. I mean, canceling itself obviously isn't new. Humans always had the desire to find their pitchforky moments. It's a natural inclination, but it's just easier to do now. The ease with which you can chase people out of polite society and shame them and bring opprobrium upon them is new. The opportunities for doing it are so many, the barriers are non-existent, and the cost is so low that why shouldn't people chase that rush of smoking out heretics? And I might be wrong, but I'm guessing that most people who partake in this don't really think that they're purging society of evil, or genuinely think that they're on the path to build a utopian society, whether Trumpian or social justice-y or whatever flavor. And I think most people do it because they're bored, because there's nothing to do, especially now during the pandemic. And by chasing people out, you suddenly feel like you're doing something. You're connected to something bigger than you. For the first time in your pathetic, miserable life, you feel like you're making a difference. It's just so fun, and it's so easy.
There's I think, a correct observation about, what the pandemic has done to communication in all of us. In that, all these Zoom calls, all these sort of, we're not in the same room conversations. For many of us, that was like all we had for a few months there. The spring in New York was, I'm sure my brain, as a defensive mechanism, is going to just blank it out at some point if it hasn't already. It was so bad. I mean, we were cut off from the world. My kids didn't see their friends for 3 months. Didn't see kids. I mean, I remember the first play date my 5-year-old had with a friend of hers, and it was just like these grasping baby gorillas, like trying to figure out how to walk again. It was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. So I think adults have that version too. If it's really hard to pick out the worst thing about a person and to hold it up like a scalp or something, wave it around in public to applause when they're sitting across from you at the dinner table. It's kind of hard to do that. The being with a human is a mediating experience. You have to like temper things, unless you're just like some kind of Irish hothead from Boston, or whatever. But like you have to like calm it down and figure out how to live and work in the world. And that's normal. I think a lot of these things that happened over the summer, there were like workplace revolts, places where no one had gone to the workplace for a long time. So yeah, you can pull that Slack message out and you can say, see, and like you haven't been able to, pick the knit out of your cubicle mate's hair for so long. You've just sort of forgotten how to deal with people on a human level. I think all that's part of that, but I think you're really right about that kind of rush element of it. It's just like, it must be really thrilling. I talk about this a lot with my good friend Nancy Rommelman, who's a great journalist who experienced this in Portland. Long story boiled down to she had a podcast that was misconstrued, and because of that, her husband's whole coffee business in Portland was wiped out. And it's just like, it boggles the mind. Then it happened very, very fast. Swarms of people. But she and I have talked about this a lot. Like,
what exactly happened there, if you can talk about it?
Brief story. She had only a 5 episodes, as long as it last, video blog series that was launched in kind of amidst the Me Too explosion of things, in which she, a journalist, and her friend Leah McSweeney, who's this interesting character who's on Real Housewives of New York as a character, entrepreneur, clothes designer, weird person, friend of mine. They launched it to try to talk through honestly the differences between a Harvey Weinstein scenario, which is just this horrible ogre doing awful things and abusing his power, and I forget the name of the dude who had the one bad date with a girl who wrote
he's on Sorry.
Yeah. Right? So they were like sort of trying to say, hey, look, let's dial down the hysteria and talk in ways that also give women their own, or whoever, their own sense of kind of ownership and their own agency about their decisions too.
Rape apologists.
Yes, rape apologists. And the problem also, and this is where I come in, I am part of the blame, is that they're like, what should we call our podcast? I'm like, how about Me Neither?
Oh no.
And,
oh no.
Which is a joke, but then they took it and she was in Portland, and Portland, Oregon is not currently known for being super tolerant of deviant kind of discussions of things. And so it was just like, rape apologist Nancy Rommelman is so bad, let's drag her husband's coffee roasting business. And that's what happened in a short order. And it's all closed down. He's moved to Mexico, last I heard. Like, it happened fast.
Wow.
I bring this up. It's an interesting story itself. You can go Google it. But also, she and I have always marveled at, we lack that gene, that thing of piling on, saying, when's what's her face landing? Remember that from 6 years ago? I forget what the story was, but it was a publicity executive had tweeted something bad about AIDS in Africa, and Justine, when's Justine landing?
Right. Well, she was tweeting while she was on the plane.
Yeah, and everyone just dragged the hell out of her, and I think she ended up losing her job. But the joy that people take in piling on that, I don't have that. I could never have that. I don't even know what that's like, and we marvel over that. And one of it is that it just must be pleasurable at some point, and I'm sure it packs extra visceral pleasure. And also, you've been using the tools of how to do that. In a time when you don't see your fellow human beings, you don't have mediating conversations, and you're spending all your time online, just looking for crap to doom scrolling and looking for crap to be outraged by. So yeah, it's with us. It's ugly. But I think there's also, and this goes to our previous conversation about journalism and tech and all that stuff, and podcast. I think there's a tangible backlash to it. People are rewarding those of us who kind of say dude, let's be sensible. Let's have a sense of due process and proportionality. Let's not be afraid to have a normal conversation. Let's not silence ourselves, and let's laugh at the assholes. I think that there is a market for that, and almost a necessity for those of us who can engage in that to do at least some of it.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier when you were talking about the kind of the public discourse that you've been involved in around your school. And I read an article that you wrote in the New York Post kind of talking about the heated conversations that have been happening in your school, specifically around a kind of diversity initiative that had been somewhat controversial with some of the parents. And your point in the piece was that, you know, the language and the rhetoric being used was kind of putting people in a tough position, whereas if they objected, they were basically deemed racist. And I found it interesting because you brought up that they opened up their opening slide to the parents with, you know, images of segregation of the past. And I've been seeing this. I come from an urbanism background, and I have been seeing the kind of employment of history, in particular our American racial history, actually being employed in a quite sophisticated manner. And I'm thinking specifically of, for example, last year in Minneapolis, there was a reform movement to kind of introduce different types of zoning reform that would potentially create more equitable outcomes in Minneapolis. And they actually did a really in-depth public engagement campaign and taught a lot of the folks there in Minneapolis about the history of redlining in the city, about the history of urban planning decisions that have created a very unequal and inequitable city. And so I had been thinking about that as a positive way of going about doing public engagement and potentially creating more equitable outcomes. But from reading your piece in the New York Post, I kind of started to see the potential downsides, I guess, of that approach. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that, expound more on what happened and why it was kind of problematic.
It has some interesting things to say. Like, for one, I would have welcomed more discussion of New York's actual history, including, in this neighborhood. A friend of mine named Tim DeRoche wrote a really good book last year about the history of kind of school map drawing. And it's overlap, like literal overlapping or overlaying with racism and redlining and other things like that. And it's very, very eye-opening. And that is apparently also the case in New York City, including Brooklyn and the district that I live in. Would have loved to hear much more about that because it's local history that's germane to the point. I don't need to see Bull Connor's fire hose as part of that demonstration because that's Bull Connor. That's not New York. That's 1950s. It's not what year are we in? It's not 2018 or whenever that process started. It's definitely a play to emotion. There is, what's the name of the podcast? Nice White Parents is a podcast the New York Times has done about, and like the title kind of gives away the vibe of it, which is that no matter whatever the problem of racism is in New York schools, we can blame the good liberal white parents they're the problem. They're the problem for staying in the school system. They're the problem for leaving the school system. And it actually starts with the school that my oldest daughter goes to, which is kind of funny. But anyways, in that and in some of the commentary about that, they talk about how Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, resisted for way too long in the eyes of many people of using the word segregation or segregated to talk about New York schools. And I always found that funny. Curious why so many people were focused on using that word. And in fact, he did not use that word in the first 3 or 4 years of his administration. For me, segregation immediately conjures up Bull Connor. It conjures up there is a legal system that is designed to make sure that the people that we don't like for their immutable characteristics or class characteristics are excluded by force of law from a thing. That's a heavy, terrible thing. That's all over the country. It's from Southern California, where I'm from. It's happened in New York and certainly happened in the South. That is a terrible thing. That is not what the situation is in Brooklyn schools in the year 2018. And And so for a long time, I thought this was sort of a sideline, but then I began to realize, no, actually, there's a reason why activists focused on that language. Once we establish as the baseline that what we have is segregation, that New York has, in the words of UCLA thing that came out in 2014, the most segregated school system in the United States. That has emotional impact. Like, God, we're doing segregation. We got to stop it. I want at all times the words to be accurate. I think that they can be bad enough without engaging in hyperbole, particularly in public discussions. In the public discussions that I participated in, and I have stopped because I'm exhausted by it, and pandemic and whatever. And also, I've written about it, and the decision points of their kids have kind of passed us. But I saw again and again and again people literally called racists or heavily intimated that they were racist just for asking normal questions that should be asked as part of whatever change that they were doing. The language is part of it. It sort of softened the ground for making these changes and making it seem like if you were against it, then you're obviously trying to fight for white privilege. I can't tell you how many people who accuse me of being scared of black people or something. My daughter literally goes to the blackest school around us on purpose. But that people have been conditioned by this sort of language and by the ritualistic shaming. The head of the Department of Education in New York says, if you oppose this stuff, I'm going to call you racist by name. And they've like a woman saying things at a meeting, engaging in public participation. Boop, there's someone recorded on an iPhone. The chancellor puts it up, calls her a racist, and is she ever going to go to a meeting again? And what she said wasn't racist, by the way, too. And I saw this again and again and again. It's crazy.
Do you remember what she said?
I don't. I do remember a guy who was accused of by a shakingly angered community education board guy. The guy who's a Swedish or Scandinavian parent of some sort, who prefaced his comment with, "I totally support this new equity desegregation plan that you're doing. It's going to be great. I should mention," he says, "that my daughter didn't get any of the 9 schools that she picked as part of your solution to this problem. And she got sent to a faraway school, which is going to be a pain in our ass. But hey, we support this. But my question for you," he says to them, "is what are you going to tell other parents who, when they get these results, aren't happy and think about leaving?" This is a totally important question to ask if you were changing the admissions system, which is an admittedly crazy admissions system in New York, in such a way that you are going to make and alienate parents and the students of where they wanted to go to school. Right? That actually came up long after this meeting. It turns out that for the first time in a decade, the percentage of people the admissions went down. People left the system because they didn't get their choices. So he asked that question, and person there shaking. It's like, you're sitting here, you're asking me, what am I going to do about white flight? I can't even believe that question. And the guy's like, no. I mean, that's not what I like this. I like what you're doing. I'm just asking. And he kept stammering. And then someone else would come in and pile in and say, hey, look, you can go into your second home and you can travel and go anywhere you want to. But, other people of color. And then the superintendent of school is just like, this idea that black and brown kids can't learn the same way that others is just, I can't believe that we're hearing this. And the guy's like, I didn't say any of this, right? I was in contact with this guy because I described him in my piece, and he found me afterwards. He moved out of Brooklyn because he felt like Brooklyn was calling him a racist. He was totally scarred from this, and he's not a racist. He was asking a totally normal public policy question, but the entire way that it's set up, this discussion, is pointed in that direction, and it's infuriating. Because that is precisely such a loaded and momentous word. And who lives in Brooklyn? Who chooses on purpose to live in Brooklyn? Is it someone's like, God, where's the red pen? I want to red line me some minorities. That's not who lives here. That's not, it's a bananas idea that this is like a conscious or even a kind of an unconscious set of preferences. So it drives me to distraction to see, and I'm totally open to like, hey, look, there's a local history. The reason why people like this school instead of this school, and this boundary over here was drawn at this point. I want to hear about all that because chances are it's going to be super nasty and bad. New York has a real bunch of set of really kind of nasty racist histories that should be exhumed. But to bull Connor it, to desegregate it, to white privilege, or white supremacy things on a daily basis. We got emails after the January 6th Capitol Hill riot from both principals, the DOE head, the superintendent, all of them talking about white supremacy. Okay, all of you? Did I need 4 emails about white supremacy to describe guy with a QAnon shaman guy? I mean, there was a lot of awful people, no doubt, definitely some white supremacists based on everything I've read and seen there. Is it the lead paragraph in the email from the school? Maybe it is. And that's fine. But if you, getting back to your tenor and tone question, if you are skeptical about any of that stuff, you were deliberately made to feel not welcome. Again, I don't care. I don't need to be welcomed. I'm a public person, and I'm used to having ideas that are not in the majority of where I live. That's totally normal. The thing that irks me is when basic language is used incorrectly, and then used in a way to hurt people who are not public figures and to actively discourage their participation. It's the public policy equivalent to strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPP lawsuits, which are used by big business or politicians or whatever to like try to silence people from criticizing them in some ways. This is the equivalent, and I think it's bad. I mean, the example that's more common that we've noticed from our listeners of the Fifth Column, because Camille Foster is an idiosyncratic character, to be sure. He's always encouraging people to, in his words, be brave and call bullshit. He doesn't have a lot of time for the anti-racism industry of the Ibram X. Kendi school, Robin DiAngelo, the white fragility stuff, and the way that that's being sort of taught. And it's being taught in a lot of like corporate settings. We've gotten at least 200 emails from people saying like, HR pulled us in and said, we have to have this workshop and read White Fragility or read How to Be an Anti-Racist. And they talk about the process of it. And these are people who aren't walking around with like, Camp Auschwitz shirts. They're listeners to the Fifth Column, which is, it doesn't brand itself as an anti-racist show, but it's a show of people who don't like racism, for sure. And that's just the appeal isn't the opposite. And they're just kind of bewildered. And those of them who like would sort of bring things up like, hey, isn't this book kind of garbage? Which both of them, from everything I've heard, are. Or just sort of like ask a follow-up questions there. And these are people who work in the military. This is people who work in jobs at companies that they created in some cases. It's crazy. It's just like, you can't talk. You can't do this. In at least one case, maybe 2, a person got fired, even for sort of like bringing up mild pushback on some of the claims that were made there. So that's how you do it. You fire a guy for like saying, really? At a meeting about, how to behave and talk in public. And like we've seen some of the sort of talking points like, don't push back against these arguments or against these people. That would be sort of like a rude or an aggression of some sorts. Those are the people who are going to get radicalized, of course. I mean, not even radicalized in the putting on a hat and being a crazy person and spend the next 10 years in the federal pokey, but just like, a person who gets fired for that is going to be pretty committed to the anti-woke team for a good long time and very open to messages from those who are talking about that stuff all the time. I don't think that's productive.
I'll just say, so from my experience of corporate racial sensitivity trainings, and I've been through a few under different employers, there was one thing that really shocked me. It was that until that time, I was sure that nobody uses the term microaggression unironically. It shocked me to be disabused of this notion.
I'll just say, to put a button on it, that a lot of people have experienced some pretty crazy HR over the past 12 months, and the stories would shock the average listener if it hasn't happened to them already. And if you think that that's going to produce better political outcomes, I think that's a bad prediction.
How do you? The problem with all of this is that I mean, there are so many problems, but one of the things that makes it so difficult is that you can see how all those events are also inciting crazy reactions on the right. Not just reactions, it's inciting a whole industry that feeds off it. When you see, forget about Trump, Tucker Carlson, Hannity, Holly, because he was dropped by his publisher, talk about cancel culture, you start losing track of what the hell we're talking about. It's calling every single thing cancel culture, seeing every single act of disapproval or groups showing their disdain and anger as cancel culture. You can see how this is getting exploited by the industry on the other side. My question to you is, how do you reach some kind of level-headed balance when reporting and talking about these issues? How do you draw those lines?
I mean, the famous quote from Orwell, right, is to see the nose in front of one's face requires a constant struggle, which I've always taken to heart and have enjoyed. But an important part as like maintenance for me is to get the hell away from the political machine. Get off of the Twitter, get off of work, spend weekends, unless I want to work, but like weekending and hanging out with human beings. The extent to which that we mistake Twitter or whatever our social media is of choice with the real world is astonishing. And like to put it in a political context, the only Democratic candidate who seemed to understand that was Joe Biden. Right? Everyone was running to be the queen or king of the Twitter sensibility. That ain't the Democratic Party sensibility, son. You're not going to win elections by competing for the woke trophy. That's just like, that still seems crazy to a lot of people. I take a lot of heart in the kind of basic common sense of a lot of this stuff. Like, we would like to believe, because we are ourselves too much in consuming journalism and reaction and all this kind of stuff, that that there are those two parallel rivers again, going in opposite directions and having completely different ideas about, let's say, the protests over the summer. Not really. Most people are like, I understand the protest. That cop killing was bad. I mean, it's a universal. The killing of George Floyd was awful. Nobody defends it. That was bad. There's too much use of force in policing in this country. Most people agree with that. There's a legacy of racism that affects that. Most people agree with that. The demonstrations are justified. Most people agree with that too, and understandable. They might have some, questions about the hypocrisy about sort of social distancing and masks, but let's put that aside for a moment. And most people think that looting is bad too. It's not hard. That's a totally normal thing to think. Like, I get it why they're protesting. That killing was bad. They should be able to protest. And also don't just like bash in windows and burn stuff. That's a pretty normal thing. We act like, or we experience it as it's not normal. So when you unplug and talk to normal people in your family or your friends or whatever, I live in Brooklyn. It's not a normal place. It's a place that voted probably 3% for Joe Biden. I haven't looked at my neighborhood recently, but it was 91 or 2 for Hillary Clinton. So it's pretty lopsided, And like, people find all this stuff crazy too. Like, they're not spending their entire days online. So it keeps me pretty grounded. I mean, the Capitol Hill riots as well, like just the Stop the Steal thing. So much of the things that we argue about and have these fraught public things about just like are self-evidently crazy to people. Like, it's for most people, like if you're forced to go through an HR, or struggle sessions with Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi, it's like, that's odd. That's a weird way to spend your time. Like, most people have that reaction in private amongst themselves. So one way to keep your head is to unplug it and to engage in conversation and realize that there's still some common sense out there, and and also to be fine when you're outnumbered, just like or if you don't have a team, it's great. I more and more I find myself, especially in the wake of an emotional election and inauguration and stuff. People are always like, they want, in an accusatory way, they want you to profess what team you're on, or to show some sense that that you're on the right side of X issue. And more I'm like, I'm not here to help you with that. You can find out what you want on me. I'm totally public, but I'm not here to reassure you that I'm on the right team. In fact, in many ways, I'm probably not. And good luck trying to figure that out.
I mean, having that backbone, like the confidence plus the being surrounded with people that you can actually engage in that way, is really the problem. But that's a bigger sociological problem. That's the David French argument of what's driving us apart. But putting that aside, I know we were coming against the your out time, so I'm just going to throw two questions. You can deal with them, allocate your time whatever way you want. Quick summary of the Trump era. I just read a Kevin Williamson article that summarized it as beautifully as was it a Death of a Salesman presented by Lenny Riefenstahl, which I thought was.
I can't top Kevin Williamson's one-liners. It is ever thus.
So if you prefer, here's a different question. Heading into a Biden administration, what do you see as the glaring, potentially dangerous blind sides on the left and the right?
I wrote a piece in 2016 in October of that year about how both major parties had totally given up on even kind of half-hearted rhetorical concern over the size of government and the size of spending, and especially the size of debts and deficits in the run-up to the baby boomers retiring and all these promises coming due. So imagine if I was concerned about that in 2016, seeing what that's like now. Trump behaved exactly as I thought he would, and then the pandemic came, and now we have Biden, and there's really just no coalition left, or even any kind of sizable block left talking about any of that. That's going to bite us in the rear end. I feel strongly. I know that that a lot of people feel strongly the other direction, and I hope to be proven. I hope they're right and I'm wrong.
Well, Republicans do become deficit hawks during Democratic administration. So
I don't even think that's going to happen, and to the extent that they will, people will laugh them, rightly so, out of the building. Mick Mulvaney in 2015 wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal saying, and it was about some temporal spending bill in that moment, saying if we increase the deficit by even $1 right now, Republicans will lose the public will lose confidence in Republicans, and they'll be right to. We won't have credibility next time. Mick Mulvaney, 18 months after writing that, was now chief of staff, and he had 17 different jobs in the administration. And he's saying, there's not really any appetite for reducing the deficit, so we're just going to be, spending a lot of money now. Like, okay, people, they're going to be laughed out of the building. There's a handful of people who have any kind of consistent through line on that. Your Rand Pauls and Mike Lees, and really not many others in the Senate. And I think some of the new Trumpy populists are actually going to be conscious about not caring about that, and they'll vote with Democrats to expand the size of government. So I think that's a huge problem. It's mostly bipartisan. It's going to be goosed by both the pandemic and all this kind of pent up desire by Democrats, who feel like they got cheated out of being able to spend as much as they wanted to during the Obama years, or to have as big enough stimulus. And I think that will be very bad. It'll constrain growth. It will lead to an even more Washington-focused life, president-focused politics, and we're just going to be spending more on debt service than on the military, and we're going to start taking haircuts, mandatory benefit cuts in these old age promises sooner rather than later, like during this administration, maybe even on some of it. That's going to be bad to live through, and it's going to make the politics even more crabby. So I don't like that. The right is in disarray. It's in delusional disarray. They have a chunk of it has a problem seeing the universe straight at all, and it's not good anymore. It maybe never was good, but like when you have 127 members of Congress voting to not certify an election that was fine. And doing that even after the place is ransacked by insane people who they whipped up and told lies to, we got a problem on our hands. It's a very, very serious problem. And until that problem is resolved in some ways, it kind of doesn't matter what they think about or talk about. That's just like, that's an information rot, and also a moral rot. The Trump presidency really exposed how shallow the morality was of a lot of people, and that includes a lot of people in media as well, right-wing media. It's really, really awful, and I hope that they are haunted by what they see looking out at them in the mirror. And I hope they've had a real bad 2 weeks, because they should have had a really bad 2 weeks and going forward. So, I think Trump will be, I think maybe you said bull in a china shop earlier. Maybe you didn't. Maybe I'm making that up. But
that's sledgehammer.
I've always seen him as again, a terrible metaphor, but as an elephant man in a beauty contest. So you bring him there just to show that what you think is a beauty contest is actually super ugly. And this, all the stuff that you thought was all fancy and all your peaceful transfers of power and all your pomp and circumstance was garbage, and to produce bad outcomes and bad people, which there's an argument for that. Produced the Iraq War, among many catastrophes. And so you bring this kind of agent there. So there's an unleashing of populism, or a leaning into the populism that we've seen in around the globe the last 10, 15 years. I never really thought America would be part of that. I'm still fundamentally traumatized by 2015, by the fact that Republicans would choose that guy after what he says and the way that he comported himself. And that says
the European style of nationalism.
Yeah. My wife is French. I'm familiar with this breed. And when even the French can figure out a way to make sure that the National Front doesn't get into office, that's troubling. And it says to me, that's a long cycle. That's not 4 years. It's probably more like 20. We still haven't seen, full Bernieism hasn't been tried, and it's going to be this tantalizing thing just out of reach. I think that at some point that's going to burst through, and that style of populism will be tried on a national level. And I don't think that'll be good for the country. So I'm unusually, for my own temperament, I'm pessimistic about that style of American politics for a while.
Great note to end on. Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And sorry to ramble on, but it's nice to have a conversation.
That was great. Thank you.
It's great. Sorry for being in a disoriented day myself.
It's inaugurated. It's 2021. We're not gonna clean it up until the fall.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Please spread the word to your friends and enemies. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media and are always happy to get into arguments there. Hope to see you soon. Stay sane.